foreign ministers of the Southeast Asian ASEAN bloc have met in Jakarta and have been joined by top envoys from China, Russia and the US. What brought the visitors from afar? Who's looking for what and from whom? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Emily Angwin. We don't want ASEAN to become a proxy for other countries. The words of Indonesia's President Joko Widodo as foreign ministers from 10 Southeast Asian countries meet in the capital Jakarta. Running through the region are major fault lines of disputes between East and West. The arrival of top diplomats from China, Russia and the US underline the importance of the region and its potential flashpoints. Taiwan, North Korea, Russia's war in Ukraine, territorial disputes in the South China Sea, to name just a few. So is ASEAN at risk of being used by more powerful countries? We'll be discussing all that and ASEAN's wider role in world affairs with our guests. But first, Jessica Washington reports from the regional forum in the Indonesian capital.
It's been a week of intense diplomacy here in Jakarta, with top diplomats from around the world coming to Jakarta for talks with their ASEAN counterparts. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and China's top diplomat Wang Yi all in town for these discussions, as well as the foreign ministers from a string of other countries: Australia, India, the UK, South Korea and even representation from North Korea. North Korea's ambassador to Indonesia sitting in on some of those meetings. Now, with such a diverse range of countries, it's no surprise that there are a diverse range of topics to cover, mostly focusing on security issues in the Asia-Pacific. Among the issues raised during this week of talks, significant regional security issues. These include North Korea's ballistic missile launches, the South China Sea, the war in Ukraine, which Secretary Blinken reiterated to his ASEAN colleagues is causing direct harm to people across the region, exacerbating food and energy crises, and of course the crisis in Myanmar with the escalation of violence unfolding there. Host nation Indonesia has emphasized the importance of keeping the region peaceful and stable. Speaking with her ASEAN counterparts, Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi stressed the need to keep the region peaceful and that it cannot become a battleground or a proxy in great power rivalry. The most pressing issue for the bloc at this moment is the violence in Myanmar and the deteriorating situation there. In the communique of ASEAN foreign ministers, they strongly condemned the continued acts of violence in Myanmar, including airstrikes, artillery shelling and the destruction of public facilities, and they urged all parties to take action to stop the violence. The meetings come as doubts over the effectiveness and credibility of the ASEAN bloc continue to emerge, particularly as there are questions over the unity of the bloc in facing some of the region's biggest challenges, including, chief among them, the crisis and unfolding violence in Myanmar. Jessica Washington in Jakarta for Inside Story.
So what is ASEAN? The Association of Southeast Asian Nations was created in 1967 to stand against communism, but has evolved over the years by fostering trade, security and other bilateral relations. It has 10 members: Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam and Myanmar. They have a population of 662 million and a combined GDP of $3.2 trillion. ASEAN is party to the largest free trade agreement in the world, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, along with China, New Zealand, Australia, Japan and South Korea. All right, let's bring in our guests. In Singapore, Ian Chong, an Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. In Washington, D.C., Shirley Yu, a Senior Visiting Fellow at the London School of Economics. And in Beijing, Einar Tangen, a Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute. A very warm welcome to you all and thanks for joining us on the program. Einar, I'm going to start with you. Just how relevant is ASEAN on a global stage today?
Well, it's increasingly relevant because of its growth. If you look at almost all indices, they are way, way ahead. They're part of this kind of larger China, Asian economic bloc, not only through RCEP, but through the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been helping with infrastructure and things like that. So it's become a kind of an area of interest. The United States, the U.S. has been involved 10 years after ASEAN was created, but it was always seen as a strategic issue. Now it's increasingly becoming economic. It has a very large trade surplus with the U.S., and a lot of the goods that were previously coming directly from China are actually now coming from ASEAN states. There are intermediate goods that are made in China, then shipped there, but finished products are going out. So economically, politically, obviously, very relevant.
Shirley, do you agree? Is ASEAN relevant today on a global stage?
Absolutely. ASEAN is the world's possibly most unassuming economic superpower. It is today about 3.4% of the global GDP on nominal terms. That is about 3/4 of the Japanese economy. But the economic scale is expected to quadruple by 2040. And that'll make it much larger than Japan in Asia and Germany in Europe. Quadrupling the economy was actually Deng Xiaoping's idea at the initiation of China's reform and opening up. And so the idea itself is extremely bold and exciting. And I think it's fair to say that the global growth opportunities really lies in South and Southeast Asia in the coming decades.
Ian, your reaction?
So I think there's a common confusion between Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Southeast Asia, the countries who are member states of ASEAN, certainly they have the economic attributes that were earlier described. However, if you're talking about ASEAN as a corporate actor, as an organization, it certainly lacks unity. It has a lot of trouble trying to put initiatives across. I mean, in the description right at the front, we heard how President Jokowi, this year's ASEAN chair, Indonesia, saying that, well, they don't want to be put in a position of major power competition. Well, the positions that ASEAN put forward are in the passive, right? They don't want to do things. They have a lot of trouble trying to put forward what they want. And this includes trying to deal with the unfolding crisis in Myanmar.
Yes, I want to break down all of those issues one by one throughout the program. But first of all, I guess my question to you, Ian, is then, based on what you've just said, what is the biggest challenge for the bloc?
I think the biggest challenge right now is really ASEAN unity. The different member states, while they all broadly want economic gains, they broadly want stability, there is a lot more difference over how to achieve those ends, and what might need to be sacrificed, what kinds of initiative needs to be taken. So the default sort of holding position is this sort of very passive we don't want to choose sides, we don't want this, we don't want that, that we're seeing right now. So that inability to put forward an initiative to try to address whether it's the Myanmar issue, whether it's about trying to get the major powers on the same page, that I think is really what is a stumbling block for ASEAN at this point in time.
I noticed that you were shaking your head there. So you don't agree the biggest challenge for the bloc is managing these escalating tensions potentially between the US and China?
Well, I don't think it's ASEAN's job to figure out how to get Russia, the United States, and China together. That is going to be a very separate conversation. I do agree that it is 10 members, and they don't agree. But I think it's wrong to put this kind of Western gloss on this particular organization. It is a consensus organization, not corporate. It's not like the UN where you get enough votes and you can pass things. This is a group that has to, sovereign states have to agree with each other. So they have been putting pressure on Myanmar, but they're not kicking them out. They're not putting, big sanctions on them and things like this. What they're trying to do is bring them back into the fold. I think in most Asian countries, there's this feeling that you have to be patient, that tomorrow is another day and another day will follow that, and things change invariably. So I don't think it's very useful to set deadlines and say, oh, well, you have to do this, that, and the other thing. These are sovereign countries and they have to be respected.
Ian, the summit has condemned.
I don't agree with that. I really don't agree with that. I think that may be the view from Beijing, but Beijing does not have a monopoly on what is Asian. right?
That is not the
highly
view from
diverse.
Beijing. That
So,
is a view, a cultural view. You're reflecting a view that's very much Western.
I'm just going to interrupt, gentlemen. I'm just going to interrupt you there. I'm going to let Ian finish what he has to say, and then Shirley can respond, and then Einar, you can respond to that. So, Ian, please go ahead.
So, I don't think it's ASEAN, has any role in managing USPRC relations. That's something up to the major powers, but it does have a role in putting forward its own plan. This doesn't have to be putting forward a deadline, but it does need some sort of plan to have the 5-point consensus that really, doesn't incentivize or disincentivize, for that matter, but certain kinds of behavior is one of the reasons why we're seeing this dragging out of the Myanmar situation. I mean, that is the outcome. Shirley,
did you want to respond?
I agree that ASEAN faces both internal and external issues. Yes, ASEAN is a loosely connected trade bloc. Inter-ASEAN trade and FDI inflow is significantly higher than intra-ASEAN economic activities. So the bloc definitely needs to expand internal trade investment, enable visa-free travels, and further integrate the regional supply chains, all of which will be crucial for its success. But ASEAN is also not to be underestimated. Let's recall the RCEP agreements. Because of ASEAN's unassuming power, China, Japan, and Korea were able to reach a free trade agreement, which otherwise would have been completely inconceivable given the historical hostilities. So ASEAN might surprise the world again, not just because of, seemingly, the lack of political cohesion or ideological allegiance to one another, but really because of a coherent aspiration for a collective ASEAN rise.
Einar, if I can just return to the Myanmar issue, do you think that the summit has moved the needle at all when it comes to this continuing crisis in Myanmar?
No, I don't think they have. I mean, the situation in Myanmar is fairly intractable already. There's a lot of scrutiny of illegal oil trades that are going on there. There are people who are taking advantage of the chaos once again to make money. But this idea that, nothing has been accomplished by ASEAN, I shouldn't say that, that's overstating it. But, look at what they have accomplished, the RCEP. The growth in ASEAN is now the envy of the world. So this idea that, it doesn't function and there's something wrong with it and it has to adopt a kind of Western value approach, and set deadlines, I think is wrong. And, obviously, there's plenty of room to disagree. But you do have to look at the results. And at this juncture, the results are pretty good. You can't just isolate Myanmar and say, look, because they're not dealing with Myanmar the way you want them to, therefore it's a failure. You have to look at the entire picture. Right now, it looks pretty good.
One of the other pressing issues that was on the agenda was that ASEAN and China on Thursday reaffirmed their commitment to speed up negotiations on that long-delayed code of conduct in the South China Sea. Ian, if I can ask you, why has this been dragged out and what impact, if any, will this code of conduct have on what happens in the South China Sea?
So the code of conduct was initially put forward as a way perhaps to govern behavior on the South China Sea, to avoid escalation, to avoid tensions getting out of control. Now, what the situation has sort of developed into, I mean, this is one of the reasons why the negotiations have taken over 20 years now. The basic point is that there is doubt among ASEAN members, and the degree of doubt will vary about whether China will keep to whatever commitments it makes. And conversely, if they are held to commitments, ASEAN members, that is, they may be sort of overly hemmed in. Now, on the PRC side, I suppose there is concern that, if you have sort of rules that try to limit what Beijing can do, it may not, it may not have the sort of freedom of action it wants, especially as it seeks to pursue its claims in the South China Sea. And also, I mean, this is not this not a Western thing. This view is coming from Southeast Asia. I'm the only person here on this panel from Southeast Asia who engages ASEAN on issues on a daily basis. So I think sometimes the perspective from outside of ASEAN can be quite different from the perspective inside ASEAN, and perhaps some respect for how ASEAN members actually look at the issues could be useful.
Shirley, I'll take it over to you now. How important is ASEAN for nations like Vietnam and the Philippines, who have long been having these territorial disputes with Beijing. How important is ASEAN for them?
Very interesting. If you notice, recently with the escalating territorial tension between China and these two ASEAN members you just mentioned, I was in Vietnam recently, and if you look at the transportation minister from Vietnam, who actually recently visited Beijing to discuss bringing Chinese high-speed rail networks to Vietnam. So the historical tension, in a way, between China and the neighboring countries has always been there historically. At various points in history, borders shifted between China and Vietnam. There were territorial disputes, and at some point in time, even the culture were homogenous. And so I think today the dominant discussion between China and these ASEAN member countries, it's still overwhelmingly economic, within the economic realm. And so if you were to look at the ongoing narratives, I don't think for the broader Asia-Pacific region, it is going to be territorial disputes that will dominate the ongoing narrative in the 21st century. I think it'll be economic prosperity.
What we've seen in recent weeks, recent months, more military bases being built in the Philippines and very public maritime displays. Einar, what are the implications of the US boosting its military might or its military alliances with ASEAN members?
Well, obviously, it's not welcome in Beijing, but these are sovereign nations. They have the right to do that. The question is, are they going to open themselves up to some sort of, being involved as basically jumping off points for another war? I mean, surely everyone in ASEAN remembers what happened in Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, even South Korea on the earlier parts, where those areas were just basically used as portable bases to support U.S. troops. It didn't accomplish anything. South Korea is still in transition. Vietnam was lost and has found its own way. Now, I'm not trying to step on Ian's feelings. I didn't realize he spoke for, the ASEAN nations. I've had the privilege of knowing many of the ambassadors over the years from ASEAN and also ministers. So my perspective is perhaps skewed by the fact of what they've told me as opposed to what I've heard from him.
Ian, did you want to respond?
So, I mean, these are debates that we have in ASEAN quite a bit. And the view on how you look at ASEAN in the past, that there's some debate over it. So, for instance, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam take issue with the older ASEAN states siding with Beijing and Washington against Vietnam when it invaded Cambodia. But that is also seen by the ASEAN states that were sort of party to the supporting of the Cambodian coalition government, that it helped stabilize the region, that it helped create a situation where economic growth could happen. So on the issue of improving military and other ties with various states, this is not just the US, a long-standing view that a number of ASEAN members, I won't say all, a number of ASEAN members take, is that the more major powers getting involved in the region, having a stake in the region, would encourage these states to take a stand to preserve the region's stability. And it's on that stability that allows for prosperity to be built. So it's not that the economics is separate from the stability and the security, they are interlinked.
Ian, Indonesia's president said ASEAN should not become a platform for conflict or a tool used by any nation. I want to move away slightly from the China-US tensions. So why is Russia there?
So this is precisely what I was talking about. There's this view that having more major powers having a stake in the region would be a good thing. So the view is that if you get Russia in, perhaps it would have a stake as well. And on the flip side of it, one of the other things that ASEAN likes to how it likes to see itself is as a convening power, right? It has a way of bringing different actors together. This is a way that the organization uplifts itself and its importance, right? So it provides a platform for states partners, with dialogue partners, with different interests, with different points of view to come together. Not that they would agree, not that they would necessarily find a solution, but that they keep talking. And from that conversation, perhaps, ways forward can be found. Perhaps pitfalls such as further escalation can be avoided. So that's the point of inviting Russia, even though I think ASEAN states there is some variation on the degree which they support Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Shirley,
or oppose it for that matter.
Yeah, Shirley, could ASEAN play a role, do you think, in brokering peace in Ukraine?
I doubt in Ukraine specifically, but in the broader Asian economic integration, I wouldn't underestimate ASEAN's potential power there. But again, to respond to your question, Emily, we have to look at the fundamental feature of ASEAN. It is a collective of autocracies, democracies, kingdom, and the military government. So the common denominator for ASEAN 10 nations is political non-alignment. And today, I think, I don't believe that the ASEAN nations will be siding with the US posited autocracy versus democracy global narrative. And I doubt that ASEAN will be moving towards de-risking China economically. And so it is, again, because its power lies in its very nature of non-political alignment.
Einar, what is Moscow trying to achieve by its attendance, do you think?
No, well, they're not. It's called desperation. They've been cut off from the West effectively, so they can't even use the banks. So they are looking to open up additional trade. Singapore is opposing them and has made it very clear that they're concerned about the U.S. concerns in Ukraine. That's their right. But they would like to have local settlements settlements in local currencies, and they, it's just. When you have nowhere else to go, you go to where things are. And right now, ASEAN is a hotspot. Obviously, there are opportunities for Russia. They're thinking that because of the increased number of people that are expected there, that there'll have to be more machinery. Russian machinery is fairly inexpensive. Also, there'll be energy needs. So they're looking at the opportunities long term, although their total trade right now is fairly mediocre.
Ian, how do you think ASEAN should evolve going forward? What will we be discussing this time next year?
So, I mean, a lot of what happens at these foreign ministers' meetings depends on what happens in the rest of the world. But I think ASEAN itself, if you look at the joint statement that was put out, it does want to emphasize on strengthening the economy and economic cooperation, both within ASEAN and outside of ASEAN. It is also talking about ways to improve intra-ASEAN coordination. It is consensus-based, but there are, I think, still areas to be gained in terms of making coordination smoother, getting ASEAN to see things, be on the same page more quickly. So those are things I think that ASEAN leaders are currently grappling with. This has come up time and time again, and I think they will continue past Indonesia's chairmanship this year.
Shirley, the same question to you.
I think ASEAN is well positioned to capitalize on the best of both worlds between now and perhaps the coming couple of decades. Today, we're seeing two of the world's largest economies increasingly moving their supply chains, manufacturing, technology, and with a talent pool to the region. The U.S. initiated IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership, which just completed the supply chain agreements. And with the ongoing RCEP agreements, which deeply brings ASEAN closer to continental Eurasia. And so we are seeing essentially where else in the world do we have a region that are essentially the darling of two largest global economies at the same time. And so I think to maximize this economic opportunity and to really develop a quintessential supply chain that will continue to bring economic prosperity, stabilize global inflation for the world, that'll be essential.
And Einar?
Well, I think Widodo put the nail on the head, which is, quite frankly, it's about security issues. And what I mean by that is outside entities trying to inject their agendas into the ASEAN area. Now, I do agree that China has to be more creative than doing tit for tat with great powers like the United States or Europe. they're going to have to figure out some way of getting around it. And, the South China Sea issue is a major one. If that were to be settled, all right, there would be a quick cooling down of the temperatures there because it would no longer be in play. Any attempt by the U.S. to try to insert itself militarily or for security reasons would be rebuffed because they say, why? We don't have any threats. Why are you here? And that, I think, would be relieve a tremendous amount of tension, not only for China, but for ASEAN and the entire world.
Ian, just some final thoughts from you. We only have 2 minutes left of the program, and then quickly to Shirley.
So I think moving ahead on the South China Sea issues would be good. I think in that case, if China would agree to abide by UNCLOS, something it's signed and ratified, I think that would be a great move forward. I mean, one of the ways that we can look at that is through the arbitral tribunal process that Philippines have brought, that it had been ruled in favor of the Philippines. That's one place to start to avoid using the sort of muscle that it has on smaller actors. I think that would be very much appreciated in this part of the world as well.
Shirley?
China just agreed with ASEAN on the non-aggression pact on seafood to be completed within 3 years or less. But the pact also proposes that it'll restrict foreign activities and presence in the regional waters. And so I think it's going to be a hard negotiation ahead. But if we were to look at the just concluded NATO summit, the communique also stated that the PRC challenges its interest, security, and values. And it's interesting that we note interest comes before security and before values. And we're talking about NATO here. So I think that really reflects a current understanding globally that economic prosperity is a part of the broader national security narrative. And so it's really not just the military spat per se that aggravates China and other region. It is really the restrictions, the suppression, encirclement, and containment, as Chinese President Xi talked about, that aggravates China.
Shirley, thank you very much. Einar, you've got 30 seconds left for your final thoughts.
Well, let's hope that this works out. I mean, the issue here in ASEAN is a lot of it is about these security issues. But I do think you have to respect what ASEAN has done and has accomplished, as we have talked about here. And I don't think that it's you're going to take this legalistic point of view where you can force other nations to do something. If that were true, the United States would not be, by definition, a rogue state because it breaks treaties, it starts wars, and it's in violation of the UN as sabotaging the WTO. Right now, we need to build trust. And that is what is happening in Southeast Asia, is that there's trust being built because they are cooperating. And hopefully that trust will be the basis of finding peace in the region that allow, as Shirley has said, prosperity for everybody.
Well, it's certainly a complex region with many moving parts, and we appreciate all your thoughts on this and your analysis. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you to Ian Chong, Associate Professor of Political Science, Shirley Yu, a Senior Visiting Fellow, and Einar Tangen, a Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute. Thank you. And thank you too for watching at home. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From me, Emily Angwin, and the whole team, bye for now.